He was lying there, on that white, cold hospital bed, surrounded by the silence of long corridors where hope felt more like a whisper than a presence. The old man, whose name no longer appeared in any city records, was just another fragile body among many, waiting for the end like someone waiting for a bus that never arrives. No one came to visit him. No flowers, no cards, no familiar voice murmuring comfort or longing. Just solitude and the distant echoes of hurried nurses' footsteps who looked at him as if he were invisible. But he did not complain, not anymore. He had learned, with time, to accept being forgotten as part of the price one pays for certain choices. What no one knew, or no one cared to remember, was that this man had once been a hero, a name whispered in prayers, splashed across newspapers, exalted in headlines that now lay yellowed and forgotten in some dusty archive. His face, now wrinkled and marked by age, had once carried the firm expression of someone who had faced the impossible. His gaze remained the same, deep, attentive, full of secrets and memories he dared not share with anyone, not even with the doctors who, upon seeing his file devoid of family or emergency contacts, treated him with that distant politeness reserved for those who supposedly have no more stories to tell. But he had stories. Oh, he had many. Only no one asked, and in time he stopped offering them too. Until one random morning, with sunlight filtering softly through the windows like a blessing, a young woman appeared. She was the granddaughter of a patient in the room next door, beautiful, with gentle eyes and a curious voice. She saw the old man alone, and in a spontaneous impulse that may have come from the heart or some inexplicable calling, decided to talk to him. She sat by his side, asked his name, tried to spark a conversation. He simply smiled, a short smile loaded with a lifetime, and murmured, "Nobody remembers what I did." The girl laughed, trying to lighten the weight of the phrase, and replied, "Oh, sir, nobody remembers what we do anyway. Life just goes on." Those words hung in the air like a cruel sentence. But before he could respond, the door opened. A nurse walked in, young as well, but with eyes marked by the weight of untold stories. She looked at the old man and froze. Her eyes widened as if she had just seen a ghost, or maybe an angel. The clipboard in her hand slipped and fell. And then, in a whisper that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than memory, she said, "I remember." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. The girl sitting beside the man looked from one to the other, confused. The nurse stepped forward slowly, her hands trembling, eyes brimming with tears. She said, "It was you, that night, when everyone was running, when no one knew what to do. You picked me up off the floor, threw me over your shoulder, and ran out, even when the flames were falling around us. I was 6 years old, and you saved my life." The old man said nothing. He simply closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. There was no pride in the gesture, no vanity, only peace. A peace that came not from recognition, but from the certainty that even when the world forgets, true acts remain. And in that moment, the loneliness gave way to something greater, something invisible, yet as tangible as faith. And the story that no one remembered finally began to be told. The air in the room seemed different after that moment, heavier, yet somehow lighter. The old man kept his eyes closed for a while, and the nurse didn't move, afraid to break whatever sacred space had just opened between them. The young woman sitting nearby felt she was intruding on something immense, something far beyond her understanding. She slowly rose to give them space, but the old man opened his eyes and gestured weakly for her to stay. He turned his gaze to the nurse, and for the first time in many years, he spoke with weight in his voice. "What was your name back then?" The nurse, still visibly shaken, knelt beside the bed. "Elena. My name is Elena now. I don't remember what they used to call me. I only remember your arms, your coat, the smell of smoke, and your voice telling me I'd be safe. I never forgot." Her voice cracked, tears now freely running down her cheeks. She reached for his hand, and he let her hold it. There was a deep calm in him now, as if the years of silence had finally paid off in this one moment of remembrance. He nodded slowly. "You made it out. That's all I ever wanted." Elena smiled through the tears. "I became a nurse because of you. I never told anyone why. I kept the memory hidden, almost like a secret. But I always hoped I'd get to thank you. I just never thought it would happen like this." The room held that moment like a fragile glass ornament, shimmering with meaning. The young woman who had only come to visit her grandmother was now leaning forward, captivated. "What happened that night?" she asked gently. Elena looked to the old man, silently asking permission. He gave a faint nod. She took a deep breath. It was a fire, a massive one, in a shelter downtown. The building was full of people, homeless, children, families with nowhere else to go. No alarms went off, no one was prepared, but he ran back in, over and over. I remember people screaming for him to stop, but he didn't. He carried me out, and I saw him go back in. I never knew what happened after. The old man exhaled slowly, the weight of those memories passing through his chest like wind through ancient trees. He whispered, 27 people. I got 27 people out, but I couldn't get them all. That number hit the room like thunder. The girl covered her mouth. Elena gripped his hand tighter. No one ever mentioned your name, not in the news, not in the reports. How could they forget? He chuckled lightly, a dry sound full of meaning, because I asked them to. I didn't want the attention. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because someone had to. And with that, something shifted, not in the air, but in the hearts of those present. The story that had been buried under years of silence and soot was now rising, and with it, the man who had once disappeared into the flames was for the first time in decades seen. The hospital staff began to notice something different about the old man. They no longer walked past his door with indifferent eyes. There was a new reverence, a subtle shift in the way they adjusted his sheets, checked his vitals, and spoke to him. It wasn't about fame. He still had no visitors on record, no fanfare, no headlines, but the nurses shared whispers in the hallway. The ones who heard Elena's story began to pass it along, quietly, respectfully, like passing a candle through darkness. He had become something rare in that place, a living legend hidden in plain sight. Elena started visiting more frequently, even outside of her shifts. She brought him tea, read to him from her favorite books, sometimes just sat beside him in silence. The young woman, whose name was Julia, kept returning too, even when her grandmother was discharged. She said she felt drawn to the man, like his presence taught her something unspoken about purpose and humanity. They both began recording what he remembered, scraps of the fire, fragments of faces, the smell of rain after the ashes. One day, Elena brought an old photograph she found in a forgotten box at her mother's home. It was scorched at the edges, but you could see it clearly. A man in a heavy coat, carrying a small child in his arms, walking away from smoke. The photo had no names, no credit, but when she showed it to him, his lips trembled. "That was the third time I went in. That child, that was you." Julia asked if she could keep a copy of the photo. She wanted to write about him, not a news article, but a story, one for those who needed to believe that courage still lived in quiet places. He hesitated at first, not out of modesty, but because he had built his life on silence. Yet something in him shifted. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was finally being seen. He nodded. And so the story began to take form, not through broadcast networks or viral fame, but in late-night writing sessions, shared whispers, and the tear-streaked voices of those who passed through his hospital room and left changed. For the first time in years, the man who had once run into fire found people running toward him, with gratitude, with questions, with a thirst to know the heart behind the hero. But time, unrelenting as ever, was still moving, and his body, worn by years and silence and selfless sacrifice, was starting to give in. The doctor spoke gently to Elena. "It could be weeks, maybe less. His heart is strong, but tired." She nodded, gripping his chart with a quiet determination. "Then let's make every hour matter." And that's what they did. They made each visit count. They filled his room with warmth and memory, music from his youth, letters from those he had saved, even a video message from a now grown woman who remembered him carrying her baby brother through the smoke. Little by little, piece by piece, the forgotten man was becoming whole again, through others' eyes, through his own voice, and through the healing power of being remembered. As the days passed, a strange kind of serenity settled over the hospital room, a gentle peace that wrapped around the visitors like a blanket of quiet reverence. Elena began documenting not just his memories, but his philosophies, his beliefs about why people matter, why kindness counts even when no one sees it, why one life can ripple through dozens, even in silence. Julia, ever observant, began weaving these reflections into a manuscript. It was no longer just about a fire. It was about a life that burned brightly without ever demanding attention. On one particularly quiet afternoon, the old man asked to be taken to the roof. The nurses hesitated, citing his condition, but Elena insisted, and the staff complied. They wrapped him gently in warm blankets, wheeled him to the elevator, and brought him up. When the doors opened to the open sky, he exhaled, as if breathing real air for the first time in years. The sunlight kissed his face. A breeze tousled his thinning hair. He looked out at the city that had long forgotten him and said softly, "It's still beautiful." Elena stood beside him. "It's more beautiful because you were part of it." He smiled, faint but real. "I never needed them to remember me. I just needed to know I did right." That evening, Julia uploaded the first chapter of the story online. She didn't use his real name. She simply titled it, "The Man Who Walked into Fire." Within hours, it began to spread. Not because of marketing or trends, but because people felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Truth. The kind of truth that reaches into the chest and tugs at the soul. Messages began to flood in. Readers from other countries, nurses who had similar silent heroes, people who had once been saved and never had the words to thank their savior. The room became a sanctuary of emotion, Strangers sent gifts, paintings, poems. Even a former firefighter visited in person, shaking the old man's hand with tears in his eyes. He said simply, "You reminded me why I started." And still, through it all, the man never changed. He didn't seek the praise. He didn't ask for more. He just watched the sunrise and sunset with the same quiet acceptance he'd always had. Until one morning, as the first rays of light painted the sky in gold, he whispered, "I think I'm ready now." Elena leaned in, brushing his hair gently. "You gave us everything. Rest now." He closed his eyes with a small smile, and this time the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of love, memory, and peace. And the man who had been forgotten was forgotten no more. The day after he passed, the hospital was quieter than usual, not out of absence, but out of reflection. The news had not spread far, and yet within those walls, his departure felt like the extinguishing of a sacred flame. Nurses walked slower. Doctors spoke softer. There was a weight of reverence in every gesture. Elena and Julia prepared his belongings. There wasn't much: a few old clothes, a tattered notebook filled with scribbled memories, and the photo of him holding Elena as a child. Julia folded it carefully and placed it in a protective sleeve, as if she were handling a relic. They organized a small memorial in the hospital chapel. No grand ceremony, no broadcast, just those who knew the truth. A few former patients came, word having traveled quietly. A man in a wheelchair rolled in with flowers and said simply, "He pulled me out when the roof fell." A young woman with a newborn whispered, "My mother told me about him. She never forgot." Julia read excerpts from her manuscript aloud. Elena stood beside her, holding the old man's notebook. Every word felt sacred, not because it praised him, but because it revealed him, his fears, his strength, his silent battles, and most of all, his faith that goodness was enough. After the service, Elena placed the notebook in the hospital's memory archive, a small glass case filled with mementos from those who had changed lives in their own quiet way. It was the hospital's tradition to honor unnamed heroes, and now, finally, he had a place there. A plaque read, "To the man who walked into fire, you are remembered." Outside, the sky was clear. Julia stood with Elena at the hospital entrance, watching as a group of children passed by, laughing. Life moved on. It always did, but this time it moved with just a little more kindness. Weeks later, Julia's story was published, not just online, but in print. It was picked up by a nonprofit dedicated to unsung heroes. Donations poured in, not for profit, but to fund shelters, first responders, and memorials for the forgotten. His story, once buried, became a seed, and from that seed, trees of hope began to grow. Elena, now promoted to head nurse, started a mentorship program for young staff, teaching them not just how to heal wounds, but how to listen, how to see. Her first lesson was always the same: some heroes never speak. You have to hear their silence. And Julia? She became a writer of stories no one else told. Her mission was clear: to find those who had faded into the background and pull them back into the light. Her book, inspired by his story, went on to inspire thousands. She received letters from every continent, people sharing their own stories, their silent sacrifices, their long-lost heroes. One letter stood out. It came from a woman who had survived a fire in another country decades ago. She had never known the name of the man who saved her. But after reading Julia's story, she believed in miracles again. She wrote, "Maybe we were all saved by someone like him. Maybe there are more angels walking in silence than we ever knew. And so, though his name was never spoken by millions, his life echoed in the hearts of thousands, not through monuments or medals, but through actions, through changed lives, through love, through the truth that one life, lived quietly and bravely, can light a fire in others that never dies. He had been the man no one remembered, and yet he became the reason others chose to remember. The fire he walked into had long since died, but the light he left behind, that would never go out.